Okay, it looks like we're about ready to get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to McNally Jackson Books tonight. Of course, we're here to hear from the incredible Stefanie Syman to read from The Subtle Body, just a really far-reaching, incredibly researched and beautifully written book. Stefanie's a Brooklynite. She's a journalist with work published by the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, Rolling Stone, Vogue, The Voice, and the Yoga Journal, among others. She's an editor. She co-founded Feed Magazine, Plastic.com, and Lime.com. And she's also, and I think maybe this is the most salient for us here tonight, she's a 15-year practitioner of Ashtanga Yoga. And what that means is that beyond a beautiful fluid style in this book, and beyond page after page of remarkable surprises about this history, it also holds a really powerful respect for yoga and yogic practice. It's meticulously researched, as I said. It's honestly passionate. And so then it's a great pleasure for us to welcome Stefanie Syman.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. Makes me feel, the incredible part makes me feel like a superhero. I should have a cape. So how many people here have ever taken a yoga class? Oh, wow. Practically 100%. I was originally going to ask, well, then do you know someone, are you close to someone who has? But every time I've asked the question, almost every single hand has gone up. So, you are all a little bit familiar with yoga. What I really wanted to understand was how an ancient Indian spiritual discipline became so hugely popular that a few weeks ago I was about to do yoga in Central Park with 9,000 other people, and we kind of almost started, and then the rains came. But there was a jumbotron and an MC, and how did this happen? It was a practice that was really engaged in primarily by men. It was primarily ascetic. And here we are in, contemporary America, and 20 million people practice. So that was the question I kind of wanted to answer. And my answer, though, was really, to look at that last bit of the history of a millennia-long process, though about 150 years. And as the introduction suggested, my interest was kind of personal in that I practice yoga, but also very much intellectual in that I personally watched yoga transit from, in our culture. As I started practicing yoga in 1994, and it was almost the exact moment I started Feed, a web magazine. And for quite a bit of time, the yoga community and the digital media community, the internet scene, and it was all taking place right around here. They were really separate, and they were kind of they thought each other was kind of weird. There was, I wouldn't say antagonism, but there was suspicion. Most of the yoga people didn't have email, et cetera. Within 5 years, those worlds had completely merged, and people that I knew from the industry, the tech industry, were practicing yoga. And within 10 years, to say that you practice yoga, it became kind of a cliche. So I really kind of wanted to understand how we got there. And part of my curiosity also came with, over that just 10-year period of yoga becoming really popular again, because it obviously had been popular, as many people know, in the 60s. What didn't seem to change that much was how people talked about it when they wrote about it. And the media kind of account there were kind of two flavors. One was sort of a trend story, but it was always a little derisive. People who did yoga were always kind of flaky. And so I didn't feel like it was quite ahistorical and sort of out of context. And then the other version in sort of more, quote unquote yoga media was highly reverent and also ahistorical. And I felt that no one had really kind of dug in and understood how yoga had become so popular with a sort of critical eye, but a respectful one. So that was my project. So what I'm going to do is read a little and talk a little, and read a little and talk a little, because I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of the scope of the book and read from different eras. And then we'll open it up for questions at the end if people have them. So I will start with the introduction because it does give a good sense of kind of where I'm coming from in all this. In a country as vast and as diverse as ours, yoga has had this going for it. It's not a unified system, nor even a tree with many branches. It might be 3 or 5 trees of different species, each with many branches. Or it's a city. It's New York or Bombay, where the contrast between neighborhoods are sharp, where you can get lost in its vastness, and which changes anyone who stays, but not in the same way or for the same reasons. Yoga is so massive and complicated, so contradictory and baroque, that American society has been able to assimilate any number of versions of it, more or less simultaneously. The process hasn't been smooth or continuous. It's got caught up around a number of issues, often the same ones, over and over, as several generations of Americans have tried to make sense of yoga and put it to use in their lives. The biggest stumbling block has always been the difficulty of defining yoga. Is it religion? A practice that can be severed from the whole the way you can take a battery out of a clock and use it to power a blow dryer? Is it exercise? Does it produce scientifically measurable changes in your heart rate, respiration, or cognition? How Americans have defined yoga has had profound implications, especially since those who see yoga as a religion, or irrevocably part of one, are more apt to see in it a full-blown critique of American culture. How Americans have defined yoga has also been tied up with their understanding of the subtle body, a difficult, even confounding concept. And just a little background here, the subtle body, which I explained a little earlier, that I'm referring to is the one that's very prominent in Hatha yoga, and it's the chakras and the nadis, the channels. The chakras are considered energy vortexes, and the point is to move kundalini, which is an energy that's typically lodged at the base of your spine, up to the top chakra at the top of the crown of your head. The subtle body is not physical, but it describes a kind of spiritual physics. And yet it's not exactly a metaphor either, since once you learn to control its energies, you should feel specific effects. So the subtle body has a strange ontological status, not physical and yet not wholly imagined. How yoga teachers have talked about the subtle body, or whether they have talked about it at all, is a good index of their intentions, particularly in the first half of this story. Perhaps the most vexing issue Americans have had to confront has been the nature of the guru. Is he a monk who can teach us how to transcend the beastliness and boredom of human existence? A magician who can unlock the mysteries of the occult? A charlatan or a god-man, a healer of bodies or of souls? Any given guru might appear to be both monk and magician, charlatan and god-man, depending on your perspective, and yoga quickly found adherents and critics in America in almost equal numbers. To tell the story of yoga here is to negotiate between the conflicting claims of devotees and skeptics. One thing, though, is clear. When Americans first learned about yoga in the 19th century, they learned that it required annihilating the body and the world, and that it perverted one's moral sense. They learned that yoga corrupted body and soul. It was about as useful as malaria or consumption, but it was far easier to avoid. Over about 100 years, Americans' understanding of yoga changed dramatically, from bewilderment and hostility to a foreign, even heathen practice, to widespread admiration and acceptance. But unlike the turning of homely caterpillar to butterfly, this process was not foreordained, not coded into the discipline itself. Indian swamis and their American disciples, American yoga teachers and students, and fellow travelers slowly and deliberately chipped away at the bigotry, fear, and misinformation that encased yoga, that at first made the spiritual discipline seem like a very bad idea indeed. To do this, they used a variety of tools and tactics. One was careful editing. The earliest Indian purveyors of yoga in America, people such as Swami Vivekananda, felt Americans would abuse certain elements of the practice and its philosophy, so they were highly selective in teaching. Like Hollywood directors skilled at making older stars look young, they'd show yoga only from certain angles, in soft, radiant light. Such subtractions and elisions continue to this day. Another common tactic has been to couple yoga to some other cause or movement with a lot of energy and momentum, such as alternative medicine or psychedelics. At the time, this move often feels disastrously misguided, and its immediate consequences are unclear. Yet for yoga, such couplings have had several useful effects. Because these mongrel movements, however contentious, have the country's attention, Americans end up talking about yoga, even negatively or dismissively, more than they would otherwise have. Famous and sometimes esteemed individuals associate themselves with the practice, which adds to its currency. And finally, yoga benefits from the energy behind these other ideas, as their advocates make great efforts to legitimize themselves and to root their ephemeral practices in something more substantial. Of course, there's much more to this process than a few good rhetorical tricks and savvy PR. Mostly, yoga has become a very good thing, good enough for the first family to include in their Easter celebrations, because thousands of people, Henry David Thoreau, Pierre A. Bernard, Margaret Woodrow Wilson, Christopher Isherwood, and Sally Kempton among them, have devoted themselves to the discipline, often in defiance of prevailing mores. This book tells their stories. Needless to say, the teachers, students, and sympathizers who have contributed to the assimilation of yoga are beyond numbering. No author could do justice to them all. So this book's sets out to show how and why certain forms of yoga took hold in particular eras. It also shows how yoga has forced Americans to reckon with a whole host of assumptions about themselves and the nature of reality. The discipline almost immediately challenged Americans' belief that the physical world wasn't sacred, as well as the Cartesian split between mind and body. You could say yoga has given us a way out of these maddening dualities. Yoga has also been the aspect of Asian culture most readily and widely assimilated, outside of food, though Buddhism was taken up with just as much interest at first. Yoga, then, is one of the first and most successful products of globalization, and it has augured a truly post-Christian, spiritually polyglot country. Finally, yoga has been a sort of multiplier, increasing the number of divine interlocutors. No longer is this a role reserved for a few long-dead prophets. Your guru might well be a channel for the divine, and the discipline promises that you might be too. It's this possibility of turning yourself into the very thing you worship, call it God, superconsciousness, Brahman, Krishna, Kali, Shiva, the self, that animates this story. So, I'm gonna condense 50 or so years of history, but what happens in the beginning was that the Transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau in particular, were very interested in Indian philosophy, and they read books in translation. Emerson collected a bunch, Thoreau had to borrow his, and Emerson wasn't interested in the practice of yoga, but he was so interested in Indian philosophy and incorporated lots of ideas he took from it into his work. Thoreau actually, I believe, tried to practice, and some scholars argue pretty convincingly that he went to Walden to do yoga, essentially. And you can see in his work, it's rife with references to the Bhagavad Gita and some other Indian texts. So it's not difficult to believe this, and he even once referred to himself as an aspiring yogi. But he had a problem, which was that there were no Indian teachers here. So he had to learn from books. And if you've ever read a yoga scripture, it's really tough. They're very coded, and the discipline is really transmitted from guru to disciple. So even if you had a text in your lineage, a lot was explained by the guru. So Thoreau had to kind of make it up as he went along somewhat based on these texts. The next passage I'm going to read is when one of the first Swami arrives in America, Swami Vivekananda. He arrives in 1893, but he doesn't really start teaching until a year later at this summer resort/spiritual retreat called Greenacre. And he brings a kind of yoga that is not like what you see now. So I'll read this and explain a little more. In the summer of 1894, two imaginative and independent-minded women turned Greenacre, a hotel located on the grassy banks of a river in southern Maine, into a spiritual retreat. The hotel, built on a 10-acre parcel of riverfront property and conveniently located a few miles from the train station, could accommodate 40 guests, had river views, and was surrounded on three sides by verdant fields. From a business perspective, turning Greenacre into a spiritual retreat was a sound move. That summer, the place was filled to capacity, as were several cottages in the surrounding town of Eliot. Eliot residents welcomed the tourists. Some rented rooms in their homes to accommodate the surfeit of visitors. At the same time, the locals were horrified by a number of activities that went on in the resort. They were particularly appalled by the younger guests who traversed Greenacre's well-tended lawns at daybreak, barefoot. Farmers would hide behind the walls to watch the ladies, their dresses hiked scandalously to their knees, as they paraded around in the damp grass. Strange as their morning ritual must have seemed, there was nothing mystical about it. The dew-walkers, as they came to be known, strolled for their health on the advice of a German priest, who also recommended tenting and cold baths. There were other unusual rites. Every morning, a turbaned young Indian would lead a handful of men and women across the fields, beyond the hotel and into the woods. They'd disappear for an hour or so and return much the same way, the Swami in front, the others bunched behind. There were no secrets in Eliot, and soon enough the purpose of these excursions was revealed. Local papers reported that each morning, Vivekananda, the Hindu monk from India, would sit cross-legged under a tall pine about 3/4 of a mile up from the river and discourse of things of the soul. Josephine Locke, one of the women present, jotted down some of his more striking points. Under thick spreading branches, the Swami talked about the nature of God and worship, the morality of unity, and exhorted his listeners to love God for love's sake, not for health or money. From Locke's notes, it's also clear the young Swami began to teach the small group yoga. Yoke, he said, is a derivation of the word yoga, which means joining ourselves with God, joining me with my real self. From there, his instruction got quite specific, if never altogether clear. According to Locke's notes, the first step was to make automatic actions voluntary and bring them into consciousness. To do this, you have to first get hold of the air, then the nervous system, then the mind, then the Atma or spirit. Yoga, in Vivekananda's presentation, involved pushing one's nerve force through the spinal column. He also told the students who sat or rested on crooked elbows or even lay on their backs staring at the sky that the pineal gland in the center of the brain was the seat of potential energy. Somehow, this energy connected to God. The Swami also mentioned Kundalini in these talks, but no definition or elaboration survives. Vivekananda said nothing, or at least nothing that Locke or another student recorded, about swinging from hooks or staring into a fire. He did talk quite a bit about concentration and meditation, telling his students, the highest meditation is to think of nothing. If you can remain one moment without thought, great power will come. So just the references there to swinging from hooks or staring into fire, those were the kind of very common conceptions of yogis in the 19th century. And even Thoreau, who aspired to be a yogi, had exactly precisely those ideas about yoga and yogis. That's a lot of what it was about. And so all the way through the story, there's a constant kind of working against these stereotypes and these ideas about yoga. And they weren't just from Americans, though missionaries certainly perpetrated them in their writings about India. Indians had a lot of ambivalence about the yogi, and he was kind of considered a mountebank and a street performer by many, not all, but by many. So here you also get a kind of hint. A lot of themes are here. One is that it's women, independent-minded women, that are backing Vivekananda. And I think one of the reasons why yoga's had this strange status in America is because it's been an activity that's been dominated by women for much of its history, even though the teachers are often men. Another thing you get a hint of is that Vivekananda talked about the subtle body, but he doesn't really explain it here. And it's a subtle body that's very common in a type of yoga, Hatha yoga, the one with all the postures. But from almost the moment yoga arrived here, there was sectarianism. So within Vivekananda's organization, which was well established within a few years of his arrival, there was a tension between people teaching Hatha yoga and people teaching what he called Raja yoga, which is a more meditative and devotional form of yoga. And you kind of see that kind of carried through until really the 60s. You kind of have everything kind of happening at once a little bit more. But Vivekananda didn't think Hatha yoga was appropriate for Americans, and there was a lot of fear about teaching. It was a tantric yoga. A lot of fear about teaching things connected to tantra because there's sex rights involved, and what would Americans make of this, and the fear of abuse. There's a lot about that in the book. I'm not going to read about that, but I'm going to kind of jump ahead to Los Angeles. I'm going to go across the country in the late 30s and early 40s. And by this point, yoga is pretty well established here. There are lots of teachers within Vivekananda's organization teaching this devotional meditative kind of yoga. And there are some independent Hatha yoga teachers. There's been quite a bit of Hatha yoga taught in New York, actually, in upstate. So, and Yogananda, another teacher people might be familiar with, would set up his base in LA in the 20s. So yoga's actually been around for a while and pretty well subscribed to. And yet it still had labored under this reputation of being kind of silly activity of women. But what happens in the late 30s is that Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood and Gerald Hurd, all three British expatriate intellectuals, start really getting involved in yoga, and particularly the kind of yoga taught at the Vedanta Center in Hollywood. And their association really kind of brought it to the fore and made it legitimized it in many ways. And what I'm going to read is a passage about Christopher Isherwood first discovering yoga and his sort of first experiences of it, because I was really interested in how people felt and what happened to them when they started practicing. By 1940, Isherwood was pulled into Swami Prabhavananda's orbit. And Swami Prabhavananda was the presiding Swami at the Vedanta Center in Hollywood for a couple of decades. His first impression of the Swami was of a charming, boyish man who looked vaguely Mongolian and chain-smoked. The Swami was then in his mid-40s. He talks gently and persuasively. His smile is extraordinary. It is somehow so touching, so open, so brilliant with joy, that it makes me want to cry, Isherwood recorded in his diary on August 4th, 1939. It was a pivotal encounter. During their first private meeting, Prabhavananda reassured the author that just the act of trying to meditate was a positive advance on the path to God. In other words, failure or incompetence at meditation was no reason to give it up, as some part of Isherwood had surely hoped. Most crucially, Prabhavananda didn't see Isherwood's homosexuality as a particular obstacle to the spiritual life. This at a time when sodomy laws were still in the books throughout the U.S. and in some places enforced. He simply advised Isherwood to try to see his lover as the young Lord Krishna and sent him home with a mantra and some basic instructions for meditation. The effects of the Swami's advice slowly took hold. Isherwood recorded one of his meditations not long after seeing Prabhavananda. This evening, on bedroom floor, in dark, unsatisfactory. Stuck at number 1, the first step in the Swami's instructions, which was to try to feel the presence of an all-pervading existence. I couldn't get over the feeling that everyone was asleep and therefore no longer part of consciousness. Posture is difficult. My back hurts, but I feel somehow refreshed. Isherwood got past number 1 as he went on. In November 1940, he had 2 visions while meditating. The first one was of a dirty white bird that walked stiffly and darted under the bed, like a mouse going into his hole. He had found it unusually easy to concentrate that evening, and during his meditation was also aware of an intense silence. The second vision was of his own face, but handsomer, rather like a red Indian with light blue eyes. According to the Swami, Isherwood had got a glimpse of his own subtle body, and here Prabhavananda may have been referring to the subtle body of Vedanta, which is composed of 5 sheaths or koshas, the least refined essentially being your physical body, and the most being the Anandamaya kosha, or the sheath composed of bliss. During this time, Isherwood became curious about Hatha Yoga and sought out some instruction. In this, he was openly defying his guru's wishes. On more than one occasion, Prabhavananda castigated Hatha Yogis as the Olympic athletes of spiritual attainment. They might be healthy, they might live to 100, but they are complete idiots as a result, he liked to say. Plus, the Swami insisted that pranayama can cause hallucinations. Though other Vedanta Swamis had taken a more liberal view of the discipline, Prabhavananda, like most of his fellow Vedantins, was unyielding. Fortunately, the Huxleys introduced Isherwood to Claire Stewart. Despite her somewhat sudden arrival in Los Angeles, Stewart already boasted a thriving clientele, thanks in part to her brother, a renowned physician, who often was on location to care for the high-priced and heavily insured film stars. At 41, Stewart was a seasoned instructor who had been teaching and practicing Hatha Yoga for nearly 25 years. And by the way, if you do the math, she started in the teens. She started around during World War I. So that's how long Hatha Yoga's been here. She was adept at explaining the discipline and equally able to assume complex asanas by way of demonstration. Isherwood found his teacher exceptionally young looking for her age and extraordinarily limber. Nearly every day for 3 weeks, Stewart put Isherwood and his roommate, Denny Fouts, through a demanding 90-minute series of asanas and breathing exercises, all the while maintaining her composure in the face of young, half-clad men who sometimes farted loudly, having not yet perfected Mulabandha, root lock. Even over such a short time, her instruction got results. Isherwood felt wonderful and described his insides as a well-packed suitcase. When he confessed his experiment to Prabhavananda, the Swami replied, "What is the matter with you, Mr. Isherwood? Surely you do not want eternal youth." Isherwood was stung and stopped the lessons shortly thereafter anyway, but this is exactly what he had wanted. I feel like I really wish I could do a good Indian accent, but I can't for that quote, so I'm not going to try. I'm going to read one more passage in a sec. The last passage takes place in 68, so I'm going to catch you up to there and then kind of talk a little bit about what happens, and then we can do questions. Basically, Isherwood was at the moment just before Hatha Yoga really caught on in Hollywood, and so many movie stars started practicing yoga and Hatha Yoga and talking about it. And so I feel like the staple of the celebrity picture today is a beautiful young starlet with a yoga mat coming out of her yoga class. The equivalent practically was happening in the early 50s with Gloria Swanson, Gary Cooper, Jennifer Jones, I mean, you name it, they would say yoga is my beauty secret, or I do yoga to relax and stay healthy. So Hatha yoga really kind of gained prominence. But soon, as everyone knows, by the 60s, a very kind of psychedelic yoga was happening that really didn't seem to have much to do with the postures. And once again, I kind of blame Aldous Huxley for this, because he not only was kind of a social connector in the yoga world in LA, but he, as many people know, started experimenting with psychedelics in the 50s. And his most famous essay, The Doors of Perception, was published in 54. And in that essay, he makes the point that now, having done some mescaline, he knows what the Eastern books were talking about. He kind of experienced for himself bliss consciousness by taking the mescaline. Well, 4 years later, this is 1958, he writes a piece for the Saturday Evening Post. And he basically says everyone should do psychedelics. And he wasn't just talking mescaline now. He was talking about acid and mushrooms, psilocybin, which is the chemical found in mushrooms. And he said it because he felt that it really did bring about a spiritual consciousness and spiritual realization. And it wasn't so far-fetched. Americans were doing lots of prescription drugs at the time, tranquilizers, uppers, downers, it was that era. But he also was kind of insistent on it because he felt that while yoga could bring about the same transformation of consciousness, yoga was too hard, and most people just really couldn't manage it. But everyone could take a pill, essentially. And he called these drugs mind manifestors, and he predicted in 1958, and this again, it's Saturday Evening Post, I mean, this is the most mainstream publication you can imagine. He predicted an imminent religious revival based on these drugs, and he went so far as to call it a revolution. So, as everyone knows, it happened. It happened that way. You might discount the level of seriousness, but people were doing the drugs, and they were doing a lot of yoga and reading a lot about yoga and other branches of Eastern mysticism. And unfortunately, though, people started discovering that the drugs were problematic. You could burn out on the drugs. And so there was a lot of enthusiasm and then disillusionment. And so the passage I'm going to read kind of speaks to both, and it's about Allen Ginsberg, and then I'll do a little more summary and then questions. Allen Ginsberg has been made to stand in for many aspects of the 60s. Tutelary deity of the flower people, bohemian prototype, hairy freak, father goddamn to 2 generations of the underground. So it's with some hesitation that I present him, a tragicomic hero, an icon, a metaphor for the yoga in the age of Aquarius. But I'll do it anyway because, as a matter of public record, it was probably Ginsberg who pioneered this graduated approach to psychedelics and yoga, and because Ginsberg saw himself as an example. Back in December 1960, the poet had spent a weekend at Timothy Leary's place in Newton, Massachusetts. There, with his lover, he took a large dose of psilocybin. Afterward, he wrote up a testimonial. Psilocybin was some sort of psychic godsend that aids consciousness to contemplate itself. It catalyzed transcendental or mystical awareness and a kind of useful, practical cosmic consciousness. At this point in his life, Ginsberg had felt compelled to expand his consciousness via psychedelics. Besides the psilocybin, he had ingested pretty much every variety then available. And this had had negative as well as supremely positive consequences. On the plus side, Ginsberg was adding new types of perceptions, cosmic ones, and what he described as new data to his field of view. On the minus side, the drugs made him sick with fear of, he confessed, a serpent, and more broadly, death, and quite literally sick to his stomach. In 1962, off Ginsberg went to India. Ginsberg, India was a seedy place, a great and wondrous place for a young beatnik whose dishevelment was a form of protest. It was not a particularly spiritual place. He did meet a number of yogis, including Swami Shivananda in Rishikesh, who ran an ashram where you could learn Hatha and Raja Yoga. The Swami told Ginsberg, "Your own heart is your guru." He said he, along with some other holy men, pulled Ginsberg out of his mind and back into his body. They said, "Live in the body," Ginsberg recalled in an interview for the Paris Review in 1965. "This is the form that you're born for." It wasn't that Ginsberg gave up drugs. He still used them, but he had found other ways to reach euphorias, ecstasies of pleasure. He started chanting as soon as he got back to North America, at a poetry conference in Vancouver. Swami Muktananda, a Kashmir Shaivite, gave him a mantra, and he worked with that one for a year and a half. By the time Prabhupada showed up in New York City in 1966, and he was the head of the Hare Krishnas, by the way, Ginsberg considered him and his message reinforcement for me, like the reinforcements had arrived from India. Soon enough, Ginsberg was using his mantra, his breath and his body, to reach startling and ecstatic states right there in view of all the world and all the TV cameras, and hundreds of young, turned-on people assembled to protest the Vietnam War at the Democratic National Convention in August 1968. Ginsberg had agreed to attend the Festival of Life after its organizers assured him there would be no violence. However, the Festival of Life turned into a carnival of brutality, piped to Americans in color during prime time. Ginsberg did the only thing he could think of. He started chanting in Lincoln Park. He had begun his chant on a Sunday afternoon. This went on for some time, but the way Ginsberg was singing Om so irked an Indian listener, he or she wrote a note to Ginsberg, pleading him to do his mantra seriously by pronouncing the M in Om properly. He complied, and soon enough, his breathing became more regular. Then, not too much later, he felt a tingling in his feet that spread to his whole body until it was one rigid electrical tingling, a solid mass of lights. The electricity running through his body forced him to straighten his spine. He put his legs in full lotus, something he could rarely do comfortably. People grabbed his trembling hands, and he kept chanting. This was American yoga circa 1968. Its avatar wasn't Krishna. Alan Watts, impish and lusty, might have made for a decent Krishna. It wasn't Shiva, though Huxley, who had died the day JFK was shot, had had something of Shiva's austerity to him. And it certainly wasn't Kali, who was far too bloodthirsty a deity for American tastes. It was Ginsberg, in his thick black-framed glasses, his beard and his beads, and his stringy long hair, sitting in lotus position in Lincoln Park, Chicago, on a hot August day. As more than 12,000 police patrol the streets, he chants. As the police club unarmed protesters and reporters, he chants. As people come and go, swelling and shrinking the circle, he chants. As the sun went down and the city lights went on, Ginsberg chants. And for all his chanting, Ginsberg didn't bring peace to Chicago or even to Lincoln Park for long. What actually happened to him came out only the following spring in an interview with Playboy magazine. On that August day, Ginsberg turned his body into some sort of divine vessel. He felt as if I were breathing the air of heaven into myself and then circulating it back out into heaven. He felt cellular extensions of some kind of cosmic consciousness within my body. He no longer feared death. I was able to look at the Hancock building and see it as a tiny little tower of electrical lights, Ginsberg told Playboy. A very superficial toy compared with the power, grandeur, and immensity of one human body. He said it felt like grace. So, obviously a lot happens between then and now. But the very quick telescoped history is that, at that moment, yoga had a lot of cultural currency, and there were lots of gurus here, as many people remember. And so they became very popular, attracted huge followings, but by the late 70s, the scandals were starting to break, and the gurus lost a lot of credibility. And so really, the headlines piled up, and it was the typical things. It was money and women, usually. So, many were accused of somehow abusing their positions. At the same time, Hatha yoga had also gotten quite popular, but it was a kind of marketed almost in opposition, or talked about almost in opposition to the kind of yoga you would find if you've followed a guru like Muktananda or Prabhupada. In a sense, the teachers who were teaching Hatha yoga had to kind of convince ordinary Americans that you didn't have to be a dirty hippie to do yoga. And they did a really good job of that, and they made it very unthreatening, and it was not terribly physically demanding, so it kind of didn't demand a lot from you either in terms of lifestyle or in terms of real physical activity, but it really could address a lot of common ailments, back pain, stiffness, depression. So then the gurus fell out of favor by the late 70s. It began. But then what happened was fitness culture really changed. And as everyone knows, Jane Fonda just came on the scene in '84 with her, aerobics video. And aerobics, had already taken off, and she kind of was the face of it. And all of a sudden, yoga just didn't sync with what had become the predominant form of physical culture in America, which was very aerobic, whether you were jogging or doing jazzercise or aerobics. And it put a real emphasis on the toughness and being tough. So yoga, while classes, you could still find classes, it kind of fell out of favor on a cultural level. And what then I believe happened in starting in the mid-90s was that two Indian men, sort of their yoga came to the attention of Americans, and these are Bikram Choudhury and Pattabhi Jois. Now, they had both had followings starting in the 70s in America, but they kind of gained more critical mass and attention starting in the mid-90s, particularly Jois, and their yoga was really physically rigorous and demanding. So all of a sudden, you see people saying, yoga isn't just stretching and breathing. This is really tough. And what also happens is men start practicing yoga and not being embarrassed about it. And so you see men kind of testifying in these trend pieces that, wow, yoga really whipped my butt. So that was the kind of, I argue, that was really a lot of how it kind of became popular once again. And I think those two men in particular, their yoga is so demanding that it actually, in a weird way, requires a level of devotion more like the gurus of the 60s. Because you can't, if anyone's ever tried Bikram yoga or Ashtanga yoga, you can't dabble. You can't just go into a class here and there and think you're going to be okay. You'll usually get hurt or have a really hard time. So really to kind of sustain your practice with those guys, you might not have to run off to an ashram, but you certainly had to really commit a serious amount of time and energy, which tends to make one reorient your priorities. You can't show up at a yoga class every day and not consider what else you're doing in your life. And so that's kind of where we are. Of course, then all the kind of sub-brands proliferated and the industry blossomed, and you can read all about it. So if anyone has questions, I'd love to answer them. Or not. Jennifer.
What were you most surprised by writing? And how did writing affect your yoga?
Everyone asked me that. The second part. Most surprised was really how far back you go with yoga here and how similar the conversation around it. Like there's an 1898 piece in the New York Herald that talks about all these Silly Society ladies doing yoga and Hatha yoga, and it gets so much wrong, and it's way more judgmental or openly judgmental than media was even 10 years ago. But it is so similar to what you would read, in the 90s and early 2000s in terms of how the account is written. So that was interesting. And in terms of how it's changed my practice, I would like to say it's deepened my practice, and now I meditate and do the poses and chant. But I had my two kids during the writing of this book. And as anyone who's a parent knows, that'll change your practice more than just about anything. But I look forward to the time when I have more time to deepen my practice.
In looking at the history of yoga, do you wish yogic practice now was more like any period of that? Do you wish there was an issue of direct lineages or more guru figures? Or do you think you prefer it now because it's more accessible and there are more people doing it?
Yeah, I think it kind of just is what it is, to use a cliche, but I feel like there is room for some more teachers who emphasize things other than the poses right now. I like the accessibility factor. I think all the craziness and the money around it can be a distraction, but I feel like anyone who's sincere can kind of wade through that pretty easily. But, I also found a 1963 7-Up ad that had like slim young women who were clearly doing yoga, and it was using yoga to market to young women. So again, the history is incredibly continuous in terms of how it's kind of featured in our culture.
When did Patanjali's writing become available in the West?
Well, the translations, the earliest Orientalists in the 18th century knew of his work. So by the 19th century, they were available, for sure, in the early 19th century here. They were British in translations. The first American translation, I believe, was around 1910 or so. But Thoreau read works that referenced it, and that he could. I don't know that he read the Yoga Sutras per se, but he certainly read essays that talked about them.
With all the research that you did, do you have any new insights onto yoga philosophy, both its content and how it's presented?
Yoga philosophy is so heterogeneous, and I think I just had new appreciation for how much there is, and how deep you can go, and how varied it is, and how much the act of teaching it is a creative one as much as sort of a interpretive one. So, and I feel like in America we're really comfortable with that concept. I think the rhetoric around it in India is there's a lot more talk about fidelity to tradition, but what I've seen happen in the last 150 years suggests to me that there was just as much creativity going on in India in every era, and we just like to kind of posit, we love to do that, posit some super authentic past that was that yoga was kind of not affected by its cultural moment, but I think it always has been. It's really easy to see now in America because it's an import.
What motivated you to write about yoga and
I felt like I wanted to read this book, is kind of the real basic answer. My husband, as some of you may know, studies Buddhism at Columbia, and there's a similar book that's pretty well known about the transmission of Buddhism and the popularization of Buddhism in the West. And sometime when not long after I started practicing yoga, I kind of realized, wait, but no one's talked about yoga, and it's so popular, and I kind of want to know what happened. So that's how I got myself into this.
Talk about the effect of yoga practice on the mind. Do all cultures feel pretty much the same about that, or do we have a different point of view?
Well, again, you have to be careful generalizing, but yoga practices were really designed to transform your mind. The physical stuff was either preparatory or purificatory, essentially. So the point was to be able to sit in, if you're going to do the physical practice, to sit in long periods of meditation. But really what you were after, if you were chanting or doing Hatha yoga or meditating, was to essentially liberate your mind from embodied existence, to have an experience of the transcendent, which is figured in various ways depending on which kind of yoga you were talking about. And now the colloquial way of putting it, which is the title of a translation of the sutras, the Yoga Sutras that Christopher Isherwood did with his guru. He called his translation "How to Know God." But really, all yoga has that aim. It's just God isn't a guy in the sky. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, if you found that in the last 10 years, physically, the way that has become sort of how our muscles through training, which is happening in everything. It's happening in gymnastics and body and dance and all those other things are totally back now, very strongly back.
So you mean like focusing on powering through things and speeding things up?
So sort of this kind of power aerobic yoga, power aerobic Pilates, which seems to sort of be happening in everything. The gymnastics where they sort of stop
Right. That started happening really around the time that, aerobics started to become really popular. There was a guy who trademarked yoga aerobics. And certainly in 1984, and certainly it is a trend. I think that's part of what kind of brought yoga back, was that more powerful yoga that could compete with aerobics, that was more demanding cardiovascularly. I think what you see now is just there are a lot more people who are, there's a lot of teacher training programs, so you kind of churn out generations of teachers who are trained in that form of yoga. And so it kind of perpetuates itself. I think that there have been some recent pieces about yoga injuries and this kind of thing. I think Americans are, I think the other factor is that Americans are sedentary and we're more sedentary than ever, so that to imagine yoga as a good workout is just another thing that can boost its popularity, and even the First Lady promotes it as such. So, there probably will be a countervailing trend, but I think it's kind of fairly deeply lodged now in fitness culture in that way.
So my impression based upon your talk is that initially at least yoga primarily appealed to women and gay men. Was that the right sort of impression? And at least initially, I don't know about now it's, as you said, now it's sort of it's more attractive to the main to.
I think, yeah, I think it always appealed to men. Emerson and Thoreau, as far as I know, we're not gay, but right. But I think what happened was the media noticed the interests of women, and they were exercising a degree of independence in selecting to hang out with these Indian swamis, which was, there are anti-miscegenation laws on the books for years, and so for women to be associating with, men of color was really scandalous. So I think that that drew a lot of the media attention, and they also had more leisure typically because these were upper middle class women. So, so I think that there were always some number of men that were interested, but what you kind of saw at the level of kind of cultural discourse was that it was a women's pastime. And there were some very, very prominent men that were associated with yoga too. I mean, Dr. Janes, who was a really prominent in the Ethical Culture Society, the president in the turn of the century, he was very interested in yoga and sort of supportive of Vivekananda. In any case, I think what happens is that certain men associated with yoga change its status and culture. And so, someone like Aldous Huxley being associated with the Vedanta Center in Hollywood drew lots of interest. And I think the cultural arbiters, who were often men, had to take it more seriously.
So you've been doing a lot of interviews and some lecturing and stuff like that around this already. Are you running into misconceptions about yoga still, or is everybody pretty clear about it at this point?
That's a good question. There's always room for misconceptions. I mean, yoga's tough to get your head around. So, but that's kind of part of the process. That was part of the process for me too, of writing the book, is kind of peeling back all the layers, and I don't, that's inevitable in a sense, and people usually have the conception of yoga that their teacher delivers or what they've read about. So, but people aren't horribly misinformed. I'm not, people aren't telling me that, yoga is about staring into fires. So we've come some way.
How popular is yoga in India right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I can't really intelligently answer it. I do know that I feel like Hatha yoga has seen a bit of a resurgence in the middle class. I mean, there's also a whole demographic story here, which is that as, the middle class grows, yoga becomes more popular. So India's middle class is really an emergent middle class. And so I think that's given some new life to yoga, and a yoga that looks a lot like what we do here. But it's always there in that culture. It's kind of always present.
How do people kind of sticker when there's so many yoga being practiced by women and gay men? Just still to this day, when I tell my guy friends and I'm going to my own class, they'll say, "Are there any guys in the class?"
Yeah.
I'll say, yeah, sure, there are guys in the class, and they'll say, "Are they all gay?" So there's validity to the statement.
Yeah.
Never be laughed at this comment. So my question is, why do you think that perception still persists?
Right. Well, then the other version of that is guys wanting to go to yoga class to pick up women. And it works. I actually met my husband there. Except I think it was the other. I think I was picking him up. Anyway. I think in general, I do think there's a lingering perception that yoga is a, and I see this in comments in some of the interviews that are posted online. I think if people are going to yoga or looking to yoga for a fitness regimen, I think people do believe it's not particularly physically demanding. And there certainly is yoga that is gentler and restorative, but you most definitely can find very physically demanding yoga. And I think guys, when they're thinking about their bodies, if there is a certain machismo that still holds to kind of be able to admit to engaging in anything at a serious level, it has to be kind of tough. For young men in particular, it may change as they get older. So I think that's part of it. And I don't know, the gay part, I have a harder time addressing.
I'm not from America, I'm from England, but the two main influences that seemed to me there on yoga, one was PKS Iyengar, and two, Yehudi Menuhin, who was a very well-known and respected exponent. Did they not have an effect in America?
Oh, they did. I think I talk about Iyengar in a number of different places. I think one of the most influential aspects of Iyengar was his book, Light on Yoga, which is hundreds of pages of pictures of postures and detailed instructions. I also think he didn't travel to the U.S. until quite late. I think he first came here in 1973, if I'm not mistaken. And by then, yoga had really been pretty firmly established here. I think the other way he was super influential was through his students, some of who started practicing his form of yoga before he actually came here. And I think they were the YMCA teachers. So I think if you were going to go to yoga at the Y, you would more than likely get Iyengar Brown yoga. But as a figure, I think that it was later that he kind of really rose to prominence. And then the final way that he was very influential, I think, is that it was his students that started Yoga Journal in the mid-'70s. So I think that kind of slanted our understanding of yoga. Their understanding of yoga and their kind of ideals for yoga were obviously very influenced by Iyengar. But, I mean, there was so much yoga here by the time he arrived. And the other thing he did, which I argue, is he kind of offered a very secularized yoga, or at least that's how it was transmitted here. And so while the hippies were, getting these incredible transmissions of energy from Muktananda, people who really just wanted to heal their back pain or move a little bit better discovered Iyengar yoga. So it was kind of an antidote to the hippie yoga in some ways.
I don't know if you can answer this, but I've kind of been doing yoga shopping the last month or so, just a week, $10 or whatever. I'm just trying to find a studio that I eventually want to settle into, and are there any that you can just wholeheartedly I think just for a really well-rounded, ultimate yoga.
It's so personal.
I've been speaking for the last 10 years, and I'm just trying to get away from that.
You've been practicing Bikram?
Yeah. I would like to do something less restrictive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such a personal thing, like which teachers you connect to. I mean, on the spectrum, I feel like Shivananda yoga is like kind of over here and Bikram's over here right now in terms of it's very well-rounded and there is a postural element, but it's not as foregrounded as with Bikram yoga. And I feel like, and they have a very long history. I mean, Vishnu Devananda brought Shivananda yoga to North America in the late 50s. But again, it's really, I can say that in general about Shivananda yoga, and you could go to a class and not like the teacher at all. So, I think you're on a quest that many people are on, which is you just have to keep looking until you click. But there's a lot here, so at least you have lots of options. Yeah. Good luck. I wish I could be more helpful.
Well, if there are no other questions, then Stefanie Syman, everybody.
Thanks so much for coming.